It is make or break week for the Prime Minister. In Parliament this evening, MPs are once again debating the illegal migration bill, which ministers hope to pass before summer recess. And on Thursday, Rishi Sunak faces his biggest electoral test yet. The Conservatives could lose seats in 3 by-elections, including Boris Johnson's former Uxbridge seat. With me now, talkTV's political editor, Kate McCann. Hi, Kate. And former advisor to Boris Johnson, Alex Crowley. Hello, Alex. Shall we start with Alex? Alex, you don't feel that this is being bigged up or exaggerated. You feel this is a clincher of a week for the Prime Minister. And if it all ebbs in the wrong direction for Rishi Sunak, he'll head off to summer recess, what? A defeated and deflated man? A disappointed man? What?
Well, this is a bit of a fork in the road because obviously the fact that the Conservatives are probably going to lose all 3 by-elections is somewhat priced in. The only question is by how much are they going to lose them? So that we know. But there are broader rumblings here. Rishi Sunak came in last year after Liz Truss and he steadied the ship. But the problem for a lot of Conservative MPs is the ship is still roughly pointing at the rocks. Mm-hmm. And that he's running out of time to course correct. So the question over the summer will be, is he going to do something different from just being the nice, sensible leader who's got a nice plan and sort of bimbling along like that? Although the problem is the plan isn't really sort of working at the moment. He's not fixing very many things, not all his fault, of course.
No.
But this is the situation he finds himself in. And there will be a lot of people in the party saying, is he going to course correct? Or is this it? Are we locked in now and we're just going to hope that it's going to turn around somehow? These are big questions for him. The by-election is going to bring all of that to the fore.
All right, let's bring in Kate. Kate, the best case scenario for Rishi Sunak this week, what could happen that would at least give him some small buoy to keep him afloat during the summer until they come back again?
In terms of by-elections, it's quite difficult to see. I mean, by-elections are a funny beast because they don't work the same way as general elections do. Voters might choose to use them to give the current government a bit of a kicking, and John Major lost a couple of by-elections before he won in 1992. So that's not to say that it means that Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives are definitely going to lose. But what it does do is it gives people an indication of where things kind of feel like they're going. For Labour, it's actually really important for Sir Keir Starmer to win these 3 by-elections because they're spread across different areas of the country. Mm-hmm. They represent very different voters, and it's an indication that Labour are on the right track with all of those different people.
So in terms of talk us through where they are, obviously the highest profile and the one that people will know most about is Uxbridge, which is Boris Johnson's old constituency. Mm-hmm. Does it look as if, I mean, who have the Tories fielding for that?
Well, so Uxbridge is really interesting because it's a constituency of voters who have, you know, maybe done quite well for themselves. They've moved out of London, but they probably still work in the capital. They maybe have a little bit of extra money, although not as much potentially as they used to do. They're pretty worried about things like, particularly in Uxbridge, whether they can drive their cars or not. The ULEZ extension, the air pollution charge, of course, that's likely to be extended, or it will be, by the Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan. And Labour is actually really struggling under the weight of that because Sir Keir Starmer has had to say that he agrees with the Labour Mayor. But that's caused them a lot of problems in that seat for those voters who say, well, hang on a minute, don't like this at all. I would quite like you to stop it. So that election has become quite dominated by that particular issue. But that group of people Labour needs to appeal to, people who feel like they want to know that their life is going to be better, a bit of aspiration, that kind of message is quite important for them. In Selby, that's a very Tory seat. It's a big majority for the Conservative up there. It's people who voted Conservative for a very long time. Overturning that would be a real moment. It's a seat that has tended to indicate the direction of travel in terms of general elections, although important to say once again, this is a by-election, so it's pretty different.
So just bring Alex into the Selby situation. Do you think there's a possibility that that Tory majority could be overturned?
I think there's every possibility because...
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think there is, because by-elections are free hits for the electorate. They don't have to worry about the risk of a Labour government. That we know from the research that people have plenty of reservations about Keir Starmer, but in this situation they can happily vote for Labour to send a message to the Tory government to say, I don't like the direction things are going in, I don't like the fact that my mortgage payments are ballooning out of my control, and I want you to do something about it.
And do you think that is the way that people vote, that real people in the real world do vote, to give tacit messages to the Tory government? They vote Labour on purpose, saying we're doing this because we want you to realise that what you're doing is wrong, that's how it works? Or do you think people vote with their hearts, with their guts, with their emotions, for the actual person on a local issue in a very different way?
Well, the first thing to say about by-elections is that voters don't like by-elections generally being foisted upon them.
No.
They don't like their normal day-to-day lives being interrupted by armies of activists bombarding them at the doorstep and piles of leaflets, growing on their doorstep. And of course, what were these by-elections caused by? Infighting within the Conservative Party. It's always a really terrible look for an incumbent government to have that happen.
Just remind us why there's a by-election in Selby. What happened?
Well, it's essentially because Boris Johnson's allies decided, or a couple of them have decided, that they would like to throw in the towel. And this was, of course, around, and we've talked about it at length previously on this sofa, Vanessa, about peerages and about fairness and all these questions about how Boris Johnson was treated because of the Partygate investigation, all of that chucked in together. Actually, interestingly, that hasn't necessarily come up as much as you would have expected it to on the doorstep for lots of people in these by-elections. Somerton and Frome, just worth mentioning, that's the other one. That's where the Liberal Democrats really think that they've got a chance. And again, with by-elections, they can be thrown off by independent candidates, by parties like the Lib Dems, who maybe give other parties a run for their money. I think there's a really important thing to remember here, which is that while it will look and feel bad for the Tories this week, and I don't think there's any doubt about that, they've priced that in, Labour have already got a bit of a difficult week on their calendar, if you like, because Sir Keir Starmer has been forced to say that he wouldn't change the two-child benefit policy.
Yes.
A lot of his party are very unhappy about that, and it's actually led to a much bigger conversation about, well, if Labour isn't going to change some of these things that we really don't like, what's the party here for?
Alex, why has Keir Starmer been forced to say he won't change it?
I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to clear the decks and try to not say anything too outside the realms of kind of fiscal responsibility.
Right.
He needs to fight the election on the economy. He needs to convince swing voters that he can be trusted with the nation's purse, because the cost of living is the number one issue for voters, and it's the thing that's probably going to end up in a Conservative defeat if the current situation stays as it is. So he needs to be able to say to voters, you can trust me, I'm not going to come in and start tearing everything up. He's got a long way to go still on that, particularly about convincing voters what his actual plan is. OK, so if we're going to change you for this other guy, what are you going to offer us? Where are you going to take us? Is there a positive future that you can offer us? He's got all of these questions to answer, but he's got a little bit of time in which to answer them.
And Kate, is there always a feeling among at least a sizable percentage of the electorate that the Labour Party isn't the fiscal party and it's not the party to be trusted when it comes to business? In fact, it's a party that mistrusts business itself, and therefore you're always worried that the Labour Party won't quite know what to do with the funds and the finances, plus that famous, note on the Exchequer saying, there's no money here, we've run out, that whole thing, which was kind of a joke and yet not at all funny and seemed to be unbelievably accurate and vivid a description of what had gone on. That stuff, that's a big old deal for Keir Starmer, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually it always has been. It's not just about Keir Starmer. Labour has always trailed when it comes to the economy and actually also crime. And the Conservatives have done well on those issues when it comes to polling. And actually, the economy is generally what wins elections. Whoever is seen as more credible on the economy is probably going to win the next election. So for Keir Starmer, he's actually spent the last maybe almost a year, but certainly in the last 6 months, carefully, slowly building up this idea that businesses trust me, that I know what businesses want, that I'm going to be careful with the finances. I think we're reaching a point now for Labour, though, where that is really coming into competition, attention, with this idea that Labour traditionally has offered people hope and aspiration and a feeling that things are going to get better. I mean, you remember the famous Tony Blair song.
Going to get better, of course they do.
There's a reason for that, because Labour is often the alternative in big general elections and they need to present as one. And right now, I think they're coming up against their own party members saying, right, OK, we get why you're doing this, but we want to see more of the other stuff. I think what's going on in Sir Keir Starmer's head is he thinks, well, I'm not yet done with the credibility on the economy, and you're going to have to put up with that for a little bit more before we can loosen off and maybe give you a bit more in terms of policy. The question is whether that will come quickly enough.
So we've looked at Uxbridge, we've looked at Selby, there's one more. Where's the other one?
Somerton and Frome.
And tell us why that one is now a by-election. That's a bit more of a fruity story, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean...
Blimey.
We're
too young. We're a bit young for the unfettered and unfiltered story. Give us the Bowdlerised version of that one.
Let's say that the previous incumbent has had a number of discussions with the law over his behaviour, and those discussions have not gone his way. Let's leave it that way.
Leave it there.
And for good reason. And obviously, a lot of the electorate there know precisely why he's no longer the MP and why the by-election is being called in the first place.
And he wasn't one of those. I mean, I'm not saying he's a rogue because I don't want to get sued. But he's not one of those lovable rapscallions that everybody in the neighbourhood loves and adores, despite his proclivities and despite his peccadillos. Is he? Is he somebody that's ticked everybody off as well? Well, I mean, is he someone that they like? Do they like what he's done in terms of politics, but not necessarily his private life?
I mean, it's a great misnomer in British politics. Most people have no idea who their local MP is.
Yes.
Honestly, they really don't. Study after study shows that people do not vote for the local MP. They vote for the party and the party leader, ultimately. I know it's the local candidate on the ballot paper, but that's the mental shortcut that most voters take. It's very rare that you'll see them recognise their MP and reward them. There are some cases of this, of course, but not many.
Right, OK. So we think there's a jolly good chance, do we, then, of the Tories being defeated at each and every one of those.
Well, that's certainly what the Conservatives will tell you, and that's usually quite a good indication. If you remember last time in the local elections, the Conservatives spent a couple of weeks telling all journalists, well, it's going to be 1,000 seats, it's going to be awful. I think they thought it wasn't going to be anywhere near that, but it turned out to actually be worse. So, I mean, we could be in a situation whereby they're saying, oh, we're going to lose all three, but they lose all three by some margin. Labour being more cautious, which again tells you that they think they probably will be able to do it. But it's a big ask. The majority in Selby is sizable. The Lib Dems are running a pretty intense campaign in Somerton and Frome. You know, and there were some questions about Uxbridge and the ULEZ charge. Ultimately, it will come down to how many people turn out and whether those people are particularly motivated to give the Conservative government a bit of a kick.
Let's talk about the illegal migrants bill and what has to happen before Rishi goes on recess and whether it will or won't.
Well, the interesting question is whether it has to happen, because the Conservatives are still caught up in the legal system when it comes to Rwanda. So it's not like if they manage to get this bill through the Commons, which they probably will, they'll immediately be able to start sending people off on flights. That's not going to happen. There is a sort of optics thing here. I hate that word, but it's all about how Rishi Sunak is seen to be delivering, and this is one of those moments that he has to get this through the Commons before the summer recess.
I mean, Alex, there's this thing about, you know, when it's the end of term,
you
always want to go off in a blaze of glory. You want to go with a good report. You want the cup for, you know, to win the Challenge Cup, the debating cup. You know, you always want your last show on TV before the summer break or before you go on holiday to be an absolute humdinger. You don't want to miserably crawl off into the shadows and crevices, knowing that it was absolutely dreadful, and that's all that's going to remain of you until you come back again in the autumn, if you do come back in the autumn, blimey. So what does Rishi? What's the best he can hope for before he goes off?
I think the best you can hope for is that the majority Conservative MPs go on their holiday thinking that they've had enough of leadership elections. I think, because summer is usually the danger zone for a leader, right? It's when all the MPs go off and they sit on the beach and they've had a few beers and they're on the WhatsApps and suddenly they get ahead of themselves and they start plotting and scheming because there's no whips to control them, right? So that's why summer's always a danger zone. This time, of course, however, it is different. I think they're done with leadership elections. They've tried that. It hasn't worked.
Really hasn't worked, has it?
So I think most MPs are probably in a fatalistic position of thinking, well, OK, you know, we're headed to the rocks, you know, say la vie. There will be a small number of them that think and hope that Rishi Sunak himself has a change of heart. We've heard little rumblings of this, you know, perhaps a reshuffle is brought forward. Personally, I think reshuffles don't do anything for you electorally, but fine, you know, it keeps Westminster talking. So, like I said before, is he going to change course? And he's got, because prime ministers have the ability to make the political weather if they choose, but that means they have to do something big and bold. He's not yet had those bold strokes. That's
except the big bold thing, surely, was the 5 key points. Not that anyone can ever remember all 5, except you lot have to do it for a living. And I suppose I have to try and remember in case you forget, so I can remind you of the ones that you've forgotten. But I mean, the 5 biggies, and at the time, everyone wondered whether they really were the 5 big concerns and whether he really had got the right ones or the wrong ones and whether he was massively focusing on ones that most people didn't care about that much. But he'd have to what? He'd have to row back on the 5 big ones, would he?
No, I don't think he wouldn't row back on those because he's set himself up now. That's his kind of communications frame. But, you know, there are other things that he could do to shake up things. He could do something around small boats in the ECHR. He could do something about major tax changes. If he really thinks that interest rates are too high.
The thing is, he can't do anything. I mean, it changes around the ECHR, very easily said, very, very complicated, slow, and wouldn't necessarily solve the problem, is the opinion of lots of people. And there is no room for tax changes. The economy is not in a position where Rishi Sunak can reach for that particular lever, not least because Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng tried that, and it went terribly badly wrong for lots of different reasons.
They seem to be dallying and toying with inheritance tax as a thing.
Well, I think,
that's a massively controversial thing. I think I would say unless you live in London, and if you live in London, you feel as if you're being massively victimised because London property prices mean that people who aren't wealthy and have never been wealthy and never had a spare penny in their lives suddenly fall into the realms of having to pay inheritance tax. It feels deeply unfair when it was only meant to be for very wealthy people. But if you don't live in London and you don't have to pay it, you won't care much about it at all anyway, will you?
No, and I think this is something that you may be thinking about ahead of an election, but it's not likely to happen before that. It could be in a manifesto, but even then, I think there's still a bit of a debate about whether or not it would be a good idea. Largely for that reason.
Though, Alex?
It is a symbolic tax. Actually, most people don't pay it. Certainly, most ordinary voters don't pay because they don't have enough assets. But it's the thing that most voters agree is probably one of the most unfair taxes.
Well, if you have a semi in London,
it does send a signal.
An ordinary semi that's not glamorous and doesn't have a staff wing, and you've got no billiard room, no duck house, no moat, just an ordinary semi on a very ordinary road in London, you will have to pay inheritance tax. And it will feel very unfair.
Exactly.
You know, whether you're a Tory or not, it will feel very unfair because you'll know that it's meant to be for the very, very privileged and wealthy few. You won't think that's you, and you'll be right, it isn't you, and it isn't fair, I think many people would say.
Most people, it's one of the best tested policies when it comes to political polling, and there's a reason for that because it is a huge symbolic issue. But, you know, again, is he going to be bold or is he going to be timid? The briefings that we hear over the weekend are, well, we might promise it in the manifesto. Well, that's not really doing anything about it. That's just talking about maybe doing something about it.
They want to vulgarise this by saying it's not sexy, but that's not sexy, is it? We might put it in the manifesto.
Well, I think there's also a much bigger conversation going on here, which is that, you know, you're talking essentially about a tax that, yes, you're right, it does hit lots of people in areas where maybe previously you didn't think it would, but there are lots of people who've built up a huge amount of wealth in property and you know, some might say that's one of the biggest problems with the housing market at the moment. That and the fact that, you know, very wealthy people who have big houses can pass on to their children lots of money for a deposit, which continues to fuel this cycle of very expensive housing in places like London, which the government says it wants to try and break. So I think Rishi Sunak is the type of politician who will look at these issues in a different way to potentially politicians like Boris Johnson, and instead of just looking at the one thing, look at everything in the round, which, yes, potentially slows things down, maybe is a bit of a better way of doing policy, but doesn't necessarily attract people in the same way as previously politicians have.
Thank you both very much indeed. Let me